It's another day on Deep Space Nine, and Sisko's been asked to facilitate talks between two rival Bajoran factions, the Parku and the Navot. O'Brien's got a special mission too, one that'll take him to Bajor, only he's trying to talk his way out of it. The reason, it's implied, is because the mission is to transport Bashir to a medical emergency on the planet. He doesn't look chuffed at the prospect of being locked in a small metal box together for a few hours, but he'll have to lump it. While they go off together, Kira is warning Sisko about the upcoming negotiations. The two factions are, to be polite, a touch ornery, and she anticipates issues. She'll be there to help at least, though the plans immediately take an unexpected diversion when we learn one of the faction leaders is a teenager. To our away team, and Bashir's worried O'Brien thinks he's a dick. They sat in virtual silence for hours, and Bashir's worried it's because he's such a grating little bellend. O'Brien is sufficiently diplomatic to deny it, and even manages to sound almost convincing in parts. He's not taken with the idea of being on first-name terms, but Bashir's his superior, so familiarity it will be. I imagine it's a relief then when they reach the medical emergency, despite initial checks not showing any indicators of something that would threaten a whole village, and everybody looking perfectly fine. The local magistrate arrives and leads them elsewhere. The terribly dangerous emergency requiring outside assistance appears to be one old guy on a bed. It's not quite as simple as it looks, though, as the magistrate says this lad's death would mean the rest of them cark it too. Back on the station, Sisko thought having some negotiations before the negotiations would help us all negotiate a bit more negotiate-y. It's a land dispute, and one settled long ago by a treaty, except not quite, as the treaty said borders would be set by the flow of a river, and the Cardigans diverted that river when they occupied Bajor. The result is a not insignificant amount of extra land for Varys, the teenager, and her people. Woban, the other leader, is obviously not chuffed about this and thinks it's unreasonable, but Varys isn't willing to give it back, not when she has a nearly 100-year-old treaty that backs up her claim, albeit by the letter of the law rather than the spirit. The start of the inevitable argument is interrupted by Quark, who arrives with drinks. He learns the error of calling Varys a little lady when he ends up wearing her drink, and she leaves in a bit of a huff. It's probably not the right time for her to meet new people, but Eggnog doesn't know that. He and Jake are loitering on the promenade when he catches sight of Varys and, declaring her the most beautiful thing he's ever seen, goes to introduce himself. At least she can't throw a drink over him if she's not carrying one, I guess. Bashir's checking the old guy over and looking grim. He wakes with a start and says something about the Dal'rock. It's an event later on from the sounds of things, and an important one, but the old lad is in no state to attend, says Bashir. He thinks Bashir's been sent by the prophets to help in some way, but changes his mind after grabbing his hand. O'Brien seems to be more to his liking, though, and he sounds confident when he tells them to bugger off. Bit bloody weird, but he's close to carking it, according to Bashir, so he's allowed a bit of weird if he wants it. That's bad news, according to the magistrate, as we're told the Dal'rock he mentioned is a beast of some sort that comes for 5 nights during their annual harvest, and if the old geezer isn't around to fend it off, the village will be destroyed. We'll leave them to deal with Bajoran kaiju and catch up with Jake and Eggnog. Neither of them wants to ring the doorbell for Varys, which becomes irrelevant when she opens the door herself. They introduce themselves once Eggnog gets over his verbal fumbling, and Varys notes Jake's surname as they invite themselves in. Jake says they're a welcoming committee of sorts, probably because it sounds a lot better than "we tracked down your quarters 'cause Eggnog thought you were hot." An offer to show her the best place to watch a ship go through the wormhole is accepted, and they all depart together. Night's falling in the village, and that means it's Dal'rock time. The old lad isn't listening to Bashir's advice to stay in bed, possibly because he's got a waiting audience. Things start getting rather blustery, which confuses O'Brien, and we're told it's the arrival of the Dal'rock. That would explain the curious cloud formation incoming, and one that O'Brien says isn't being picked up by his tricorder. This is all accompanied by the old geezer waxing lyrical about the village being strong enough to fight the Dal'rock off, and results in some purple wibbly shit coming from the crowd and hitting the cloud. It's all going well enough until the geezer clutches where his heart would be if he were human and falls to his knees. Tangentially, that's not just me clutching at straws. We established in the episode A Man Alone that a knife in the middle of a Bajoran back will hit the victim's heart. I suppose it could be a different organ failing or just a random pain, but it's quite the unfortunate coincidence with a literal Hollywood trope, if so. Anywho, the old guy collapsing stops that purple wibbly and means the Dal'rock can spit a cloud tentacle at a bridge, much to the discomfort of those near it. Bashir wants to get the old lad down, but he's more interested in where O'Brien is and calls him his successor. O'Brien's not sure about all this, but repeats his words when told to do so anyway, possibly because being given yet another job is nothing new for him. Despite his skepticism, it's working, and the purple wibbly starts up again from the regathering crowd. The Dal'rock thinks better of all this malarkey and buggers off, which is handy as the old lad has just carked it. Just as well, then, that the village now has his replacement, and one sent by the prophets themselves. The negotiations aren't going well. Sisko tries to speak to Varys privately and make her see that stonewalling the whole process won't get anybody anything. That's fine with her, and she says she's willing to fight to keep the land. Sisko's not so sure that what she says is what her people truly want, and her expression suggests she knows this too. She's in Jake and Eggnog's usual position on the promenade when they find her shortly after. The whole thing is a bit much for her, and she explains it to them in broad terms. Eggnog thinks this has the potential to be a good thing. If somebody wants something badly, they'll be willing to trade for it, after all. The conversation moves on to family, and we learn that Varys' parents were killed by the Cardigans. She asks about Jake's dad, specifically Jake's opinion of him, and he responds that he trusts him. If that was going anywhere, Odo derails it by having them all move on. Speaking of moving on, O'Brien's trying to explain to the magistrate that there's been a slight misunderstanding, and he's not really sent by the prophets to make villagers shit magic purple at a cloud. Even gifts from the villagers, and gifts of the villagers, aren't enough to convince him to stay. The magistrate says he was chosen by the old lad, and all he has to do is tell the story of defeating the Dal'rock. O'Brien, on the other hand, has a different plan, and thinks the best way out of this is doing a science on the Dal'rock to murderize it once and for all. Those negotiations are still proper shite, according to Sisko's log, but maybe that'll change. Varys is looking at a map when Jake and Eggnog call around, and she asks the latter about what he said before and how she could tell if this was really an opportunity. Instinct is the answer according to the rules of acquisition, and that seems to satisfy her. So much so that she's up for a bit more socializing, and by socializing, Eggnog means hijinks. The hijinks in question is stealing a bucket. This is no ordinary bucket, though, as we explain to Varys, but rather the one Odo uses as a bed when he returns to goop form for a changeling nap. It's just for larks, Eggnog says, and will give it back, but that's still a chance to pull a prank on Jake, one I suspect is prompted by Eggnog's jealousy of how well he and Varys have been getting on. One pretend trip later, and Jake is covered in what he thinks is Odo, but turns out to just be oatmeal. Not the best way to treat anybody's bed, and especially not the chief of security, in his office, just as he arrives. The only way this could get any worse is by trying to bail and running into the commander of the entire state. Oh, bugger. O'Brien is trying to figure out what the bloody hell that Dal'rock is. For a creature made of nothing, it left plenty of mess, and some odd science stuff in the places it hit with cloud tentacles. It's difficult to get any work done, though, what with people wanting their babies blessed and crowds of adoring fans, so O'Brien legs it back to the old lad's house. He's followed by the guy who we saw tending to the old lad earlier, and he doesn't look best pleased. When O'Brien remembers him and asks if the old lad had any tricks or secrets, he scoffs and refuses to help. Bit rude, but not quite as rude as trying to stab O'Brien. Bashir arrives to help out, and they fight him off together. That's taken the wind out of his sails somewhat, and we learn he's right cheesed off cause he was the old lad's apprentice and was supposed to take over. The problem is that when he was given a chance to do the job for real, he bollocksed it up and some people got hurt. Time for a sizable lore dump, and we learn the villagers here didn't much like each other back in the day. One bright spark decided having something to focus their energy on would draw them together, so used a rock, possibly a fragment from one of those shiny things in the pilot episode, to turn their anger into the Dal'rock. That bright spark became the first of the old lads, and the rock, now stuck in a bracelet, channels power from the villagers into the Dal'rock and stops it from destroying the village. At least they do if they're not incompetent, like this chap here. O'Brien listens to all of this and decides the guy who admits he was shite at the job and who literally just tried to murder him should be given another chance, which is a pretty bloody curious conclusion, whichever way you slice it. Still, we've only got 10 minutes left of the episode, so we've got to wrap it up somehow. Not if the magistrate has anything to say about it. He pops in as O'Brien is trying to dress up Mr. Stabby and orders him to take off the robes. O'Brien is the replacement old lad as far as he's concerned, and he'd better get ready, because it's time. It's also time for a bollocking. Well, not really. Varys is trying to take the blame for what happened, but Sisko understands what was going on well enough and lets it slide. She's also open about the fact that one of the reasons she was with them was to learn more about him, and that's made her question if her stance is really what her own father would have wanted. She's still not sure, though a little prompting from Sisko has her telling him that she may have an idea for a compromise. She's doing better than O'Brien at least. He's trying to face the Dal'rock and, frankly, making a pig's ear of it. The chief is many things, but a teller of tall tales in front of a crowd clearly isn't one of them. Mr. Stabby can see it's all going to shit, and that gives Bashir an idea. He thinks the previous old lad might have done this as a chance for Mr. Stabby to take over and save the village, proving himself capable after his previous balls up. A cloud tentacle twatting the ground next to O'Brien is enough to convince Mr. Stabby to give it a go, the result being a return of the purple Wibbly and the Dal'rock buggering off home again. As Mr. Stabby is officially crowned old lad by the crowd, O'Brien and Bashir decide now's a good time to make themselves scarce. Back on the station, Varys is about to go into the negotiations. Jake and Eggnog wish her luck before they're dragged away by Odo to clean up his office and, presumably, his bucket. Bashir and O'Brien are back too, having left the safety of a whole community in the hands of an attempted murderer. They're getting on a little better at least, Bashir taking the hint that enforced first name terms might not be what O'Brien wants, and we leave them to go about their business until the next adventure. You know, it's been a hot minute since I've rewatched DS9, and I'd forgotten quite how hard it went on painting early Bashir as an insufferable twat. So much so that I had no memory at all of O'Brien considering him a tit. We know Bashir is sometimes a bit of an arse, albeit through ignorance rather than malice, and that's a good testing ground for seeing how those forced to interact with him behave. Dak sees it mostly as amusing, Kira thinks he's an arrogant dick, Sisko's largely non-committal as long as he doesn't get in the way too much, and now we know O'Brien's not a fan but weathers the suffering in much the same way as he does all the other shite heaped on him. We saw something else too. Bashir acknowledged that he can be a bit much for people. He's aware that his tendency to run off at the mouth can cause issues, and it bothers him. That, at least, is a greater level of consideration than we saw when he called Bajor a backwater, for example, though it's possible Kira's response to that prompted the introspection. Friction as well between Jake and Eggnog, though of a different kind. Shows dealing with the difficult teenage years are ten a penny, so we're not doing anything new with the introduction of a girl and watching how that changes the dynamic. Of note, though, is how Jake resists the conflict, up to the point where he joins in seeing the funny side of a prank played on him by Eggnog, and probably one born in no small part by his jealousy. I presume we're supposed to attribute those contrasting behaviours to the influence of parenting and culture. Similarly with Eggnog's attitude towards Varys in general, I suspect, one shown by his phrasing when she's not around. I've never seen anything so beautiful. I saw her first. She's mine. A line from Jake, or even just a look showing disapproval, might have been welcome at those points, but we're showing it to be literally childish behaviour in this one, so it's less of an issue. As to the main plot itself, well, the idea of ill will made manifest is hardly a new one. We don't do much interesting with it here either, which is perhaps why the secondary plot gets as much time as it does. I personally think that secondary plot could have been the more interesting of the two if played right, as an exploration of young people having great expectations placed upon them, and the ensuing psychological damage, is something we've covered on the channel before in Voyager. If we'd given that more time here, we could have had some interplay between Varys and Kira on the topic of being forced to grow up fast, something I think would have been more worthy of our attention than fighting a cloud monster. But maybe that's just me, and this is still the first season, so perhaps keeping it to the space adventure format was a deliberately cautious choice. Whatever the reason, we get another story that just about manages to toe the line while being held up in no small part by the characters. Were it not for the banter between Bashir and O'Brien, I'd probably say this was a safe one to skip. End of episode.
Any news on when we're getting out?
Why are you asking me? We've been stuck in the same cell. You listened to the whole thing.
Yeah, but I'm using the question as a narrative device so we have a reason to talk about it for the people watching. Otherwise they're just looking at two cartoon dogs standing in a room.
Sigh. As you know, because you were right here when it happened, we've been told it might take a while to process our legal case.
And for the sake of refreshing my memory and no other reason, did they give an estimate on how long that'll take?
No, Space Dog, they did not. I imagine the Bajoran legal system is backed up, and it's definitely not because of a fourth wall breaking reason, like we don't have another background ready yet.
Thank you for clearing up any queries on why we're still in here and may remain so for a few more videos. Woof.